when we think about the consequences of that on an island nation with a 1,000-year or more history of trade and maritime engagement, and I break out into a cold sweat.
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Romer, a writer and journalist who has specialised in transport for the past 30 years. And in every episode, we seek to bring you up to date with the most engaging stories and interviews from across the world of transport. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades studying policy developments in transport. So, Mark, what's up today?
Hello, Christian, and hello to our listeners. Our main feature today is exploring an area of transport which is incredibly important to this country and indeed to the world, but receives comparatively little attention, and that's the maritime industry, merchant shipping. And we have an interview shortly with Mark Dickinson, who is the General Secretary of the trade union Nautilus International, who will be talking to us about their manifesto for the maritime industries in the United Kingdom. But before that, talking about manifestos, we're in the midst of the publication of the general election manifestos of the main parties. And as we record this, the Labour Party has just published its general election manifesto. Earlier this week, we heard from the Liberal Democrats and of course, from the Conservatives. So, Christian, should we take a dive into all three of those?
I'm afraid not, Mark. I think, look, there is only going to be one winner this election. There's only been one manifesto that has any bearing on the future, and that's the Labour Party manifesto. And even though it is somewhat thin on detail, as we will discuss, I think it's the one that's worth going through. I mean, the Tories one is still all this kind of war on the motorist, how we must end the war on the motorist stuff and culture wars. And thankfully, we will be moving away from that world and I'm hoping that we will accept kind of some of the ideas behind what they call the war on motorists, and I would call rebalancing the situation, the transport situation between motor vehicles and the rest. So let's focus on Labour. So you've had a little run through.
Yes, I've had an hour or so to look through, and of course, the manifesto is available online now. It's quite a substantial document. I think it's 136 pages in all, although there are quite a lot of photographs in there too.
Mostly of Keir Starmer.
Many of them, but also of voters and members of the public, and sort of various kind of industrial shots as well. But there is an interesting section called A Modern Transport Network. And interestingly, where it starts off is talking about cars, which is kind of Labour's response to the sort of war on the motorist rhetoric, which we've had from the Conservatives since last autumn, really since the cancellation of HS2's northern sections and the sort of plan for drivers that the present government published. So it does make the point that cars remain by far the most popular form of transport, and talks about maintaining and renewing the road network. It even has a reference to potholes, which of course are a favourite subject for the present government, and promises to fix an additional 1 million potholes across England in each year, because of course roads are a devolved matter
Here's
to the other
dark
nations.
thing about this, Mark. I've got it in front of it. They're going to pay for that by deferring the A27 bypass, which is poor value for money. I mean, this is sort of the ridiculous state that our political discourse is taking, that you have to promise to fill in potholes by cutting something else, and you have to even specify that it's the A27 bypass, which I have no idea where it is. I mean, I know that the A27 runs along the south coast, but I don't know what bypass they're going to scrap. But this don't you think this shows how ludicrous the debate has to be, that everything has to be covered by some notional saving somewhere else, and yet of course government doesn't really work like that.
No, and perhaps we can remember, we're old enough to remember perhaps a more mature politics where these things were considered in a rounder sense. But now, yes, as you put money into one pot, as you say, you have to demonstrate which pot you've taken it away from, down to the specifics of a particular road. And of course, this was writ largest of all by the cancellation of HS2 last autumn, and the transfer of the money into the Network North plan, and
A lot of which was
things like
earmarked for
potholes.
potholes.
For potholes, absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
I mean,
That's right.
so the
Yeah,
idea that you scrap a big capital scheme and then you fill in potholes. So
yeah,
Labour's apparently playing the same game. Look,
yeah.
while we're on the subject of roads, I mean, clearly there was a 27 billion program for new roads that Richie Sunak had kind of boasted about numerous times. Surely there's more than the A27 that's unnecessary in that. I mean, there's quite a lot that could be cut out of it,
And in a
repurposed.
way, what perhaps the fact that that is not mentioned, or doesn't appear to be mentioned, as far as we can see in the 136 pages that we've had a quick look through, it does reflect the impact of that sort of war on the motorist rhetoric, and the sort of weaponization of transport as an issue that we've spoken about in our podcast since last October. So the fact that Labour feel the need to respond and be cautious at the same time on these issues reflects the effort that the Conservatives have put into
Yes, I
pushing
mean,
those issues up the agenda.
yes, I mean, Keir Starmer yesterday, which was Wednesday, had to say, "I'm on the side of the drivers."
Yes,
And
that's right.
and
Yeah,
what does that mean? I mean, it's a
yeah.
completely meaningless statement. What does that mean? That he's against other people? I mean, if he's on the side of the drivers, who is the opposition? I mean, it's a ludicrous kind of concept, and I do hope that in government they're not going to get sucked into having to, play silly games about
Well,
potholes and
if
being
your
on the
electoral
driver's
prediction
side.
is correct, they're going to be faced with these choices soon. And talking of choices, so in the Labour manifesto, we see the follow through on the pledge that was made on the 25th of April with Labour's rail plan to put passengers at the heart of the service by reforming the railways and bringing them into public ownership. So the explicit pledge has survived, to that, in their words, we will do this as contracts with existing operators expire or are broken through a failure to deliver without costing taxpayers a penny in compensation. So despite the wishes, the hopes, the prayers of some people in the railway operating community, that unlike in 1997, that pledge has carried through into the manifesto. And there's also a pledge to establish Labour's version of Great British Railways, a unified system that focuses on reliable, affordable, high quality and efficient services. So we don't know exactly what that means yet, whether to what extent this is going to be a cut and paste from the Conservatives' GBR proposal, but nevertheless, GBR gets a mention in the
And
manifesto.
the crucial question there is who's going to run it, and the current Conservative idea is that Network Rail ought to be at the top of the tree, and certainly Network Rail have been, as we've mentioned in previous podcasts, batting very strongly and lobbying that they should be in control of this. And indeed, Peter Hendy, is the chairman of Network Rail, has been lobbying me personally about this and
Yes.
berating me for suggesting anything else. But it's not clear from the Labour Party manifesto at all what the structure of this new organisation will be.
Indeed. And another policy that's survived undoubtedly some countervailing lobbying is Labour's policy on buses. So the commitment here is building on the work of Labour's mayors. We will reform the broken system through new powers for local leaders to franchise local bus services, and we will lift the ban on municipal ownership. So all
But
of
that's a
that.
Manchester model, except not they don't own the buses at the moment. But that is basically the Manchester model, and of course ultimately the London model, which has
Was the
been around
London
for
model
years.
originally. That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that is, and there are also pledges on integrated transport. There's only a passing reference to aviation, which is interesting. So no pledges to authorize any new runways, for example.
Right.
Despite there are extensive other sections of the manifesto deal with reform of the planning process, streamlining and simplification, which are seen as essential to fulfilling Labour's objectives on pretty rapid economic growth, which they see as essential to generating tax revenues. But specifically on aviation, what it says is Labour will secure the UK aviation industry's long-term future, including through promoting sustainable aviation fuels and encouraging airspace
Yes.
modernisation.
Lack of detail there. I mean, they've also got a section on infrastructure.
Yes, indeed.
And they don't seem to be using the existing National Infrastructure Commission. They seem to kind of be proposing a new infrastructure body.
Yeah, some kind of streamlining of organizations
Yeah.
to create a kind of single, almost like a guiding mind for infrastructure developments. But this may be an aspect of the Maya review that was commissioned by the Shadow Transport Secretary Louise Haigh at the end of last year, and which was expected to have reported in time for the general election on reform of infrastructure, transport infrastructure. There's also been a bigger review going on under the Shadow Treasury team on infrastructure reform as well. But of course, I think a lot of this was cut short by the general election being called unexpectedly early.
Okay, so that's work in progress, as it were, although again, lack of detail.
Yeah.
But there is one big lacuna, which I think they really failed to address and is kind of hanging over them, which is the loss of fuel tax duty due to electrification and as more cars are electrified. And, ultimately, at least there must be a discussion of pay per mile or some kind of alternative, because that money and they're reinvigorating or renewing again the promise to only produce electric cars by 2030 rather than 2035. So that's in the manifesto. So electrification, as it were, will be speeded up.
And but pay per mile is electorally toxic. Yes. Explosive, and you could see why, as they work to carry the infamous Ming vase across the floor to polling day, that they haven't wanted to venture into any discussion of alternative road vehicle taxation. And I think another lacuna, as far as we can tell, is in relation to sort of cancellation of HS2 and substitute projects, other schemes that might be brought back to achieve some of the objectives of HS2. I haven't been able to spot anything in the 136 pages so far on that.
They are small pages, Mark. They're A5 pages.
To be fair,
and there's a lot of quite big print. And
yeah, it is a sort of pocket size manifesto. Yeah, that's yes. Absolutely true.
Okay, well, I suppose summing up, it's a cautious, safe document. My view of it is, well, we have to say something about transport, so we'll plonk these few things in here with making sure that there's no hostages to fortune and no commitments to any extra money. And when we get in power, we'll see what we'll do. Is that a fair summary?
I think that's pretty succinct, and is reflective of the whole Labour electoral strategy of the 3 weeks of the election campaign that we've seen so far. But there are 3 weeks to go, and we
No,
don't
and
know what might arise during that period.
the road may be full of potholes and banana skins.
Indeed. Ever since we started the Calling All Stations podcast with Christian Walmar, we've been keen to make sure that it's a podcast covering all modes of transport and all areas of transport policy, not necessarily a podcast that drags you into those which are typically more in the news. One area of transport policy that doesn't receive its fair share of attention is in relation to merchant shipping, the marine industries, the whole maritime community. And we were fortunate, Christian and I, to be invited to meet with Mark Dickinson, who is the General Secretary of the trade union Nautilus International, which, as you hear, represents British Merchant Navy officers, but also other people working in the maritime sector. And Nautilus have been developing ideas for how Britain's merchant shipping industry and related occupations could flourish. So here's Christian's interview with Mark.
Well, maritime is one of the issues that traditionally we, and actually most transport magazines and whatever, don't give enough coverage to. So we thought we'd redress that balance a bit by coming along to the head offices of Nautilus and talking to its General Secretary, Mark Dickinson. Mark, can we start off by saying what exactly is Nautilus? Who are the people you represent?
Right, well, thanks, Christian, for coming along. Nautilus International is a union for maritime professionals. That's a sort of broad definition, but our core membership are the Merchant Navy officers who serve on ships around our coast, in and out of our port, in fact, globally, working container ships, tankers, LNG, LPG, cruise ships, you name it. Our people are on those ships, keeping supply chains moving, delivering 95% everything that the UK needs.
So what sort of numbers do you have?
So we organise, might come as a bit of a surprise to you, but we organise in the UK, but also in the Netherlands and indeed in Switzerland. So we have a membership.
Switzerland, that well-known maritime nation. Everybody must say that.
Well,
right.
Post-Second World War, they did develop an independent fleet, and at its peak was somewhere in the region of 50 ships. Unfortunately, that's reduced to about 14 ocean-going vessels. Right. Huge inland waterways influence, though, of course, because they're on the Rhine. And our office is in Basel, so that's a key strategic point on the Rhine. And the other end, we've got our office in Rotterdam. So we organise maritime and shipping professionals in the Merchant Navy, in inland waterways, and ashore, because many maritime professionals go on to pursue their careers once they finish at sea, for family reasons or whatever. They move ashore and they work in all sorts of marine pilotage, they work in marine insurance, for maritime lawyers, they work for the regulator, the Maritime Coast Guard Agency. Right. They come and work for the union as well.
And you've got how many of them?
Well, about 20,000 across those three branches.
And those are mainly British, are they? Or?
Well, I'd say about 2/3, yes, sir.
Right. And but is that the case? Because most people on ships, merchant ships, are of a different nationality these days, aren't they? And we'll obviously come to that later, the issue of P&O ferries. But it's how many British people are still actually involved?
Well, look, there's a world fleet of internationally trading vessels. It's something in the region of 75,000 vessels. They are crewed by a total of about, and these will be the ILO figures, about 1.4 million. International. And the biggest single supplier of labour to that fleet, that global fleet, is for the Philippines, with around 20 to 25% of all labour. So they're the number one. Yeah. Top three would be, you'd add in India, Indonesia, Russia, Ukraine. That's under pressure, obviously, for obvious reasons with the war. Russia invading Ukraine, so that supply, about 14% from Russia, Ukraine, is under pressure. But they would be Chinese, are very significant as well in labour supply. But look, we're still in there. You know, we've got something in the region of 12 to 14,000 active UK officers and probably another 8 to 10,000 ratings, which are normally organised by our sister union, our RMT.
But one of the issues is, of course, there's not many ships that are quotes unquotes British, and they might be British owned, but they're badged with the flag of convenience. Is that something that you've tried to address in the past?
Well, it's a constant theme for us. It certainly features in our current ask in our manifesto that we've recently launched. Flags of convenience have a pernicious impact on standards in the shipping industry. With the world fleet, it is complex. Probably in the region of about 51% of those 75,000 ships would be registered in flags of convenience. The top three represent about 40%, and that's Panama, Liberia, and the Marshall Islands.
Right.
The ships are not owned in those countries.
Right.
It's almost impossible for those three nations to regulate the numbers of ships that they have with no.
So it's just a way around regulating. Flag of convenience.
It's a way around many things, but regulatory oversight, taxation. Of course, operating in the shadows without anybody knowing who owns the vessel. And this becomes important when we see catastrophes like, for example, it's probably not the best example, but the one that immediately springs to mind is, of course, the ship that hit the bridge in Baltimore.
Yeah.
That was not an FOC, of course, but and the ownership is clear there, and there's full accountability. But imagine the Prestige, the tanker that spilt oil in Spain. There was literally 12 parties involved in operating that vessel, and then you've got to ask yourself, well, who takes responsibility? Who ends up paying the price of that lack of oversight and regulation?
And there has been some attempt, I think, with the last Labour government to try to increase the number of British registered ships.
Yeah. Yeah, that was John Prescott's government is what you're referring to, and he
was, of course, from the maritime background.
He was former Cunard steward, indeed, and he introduced the tonnage tax. In fact, tonnage tax was part of a policy that he introduced, charting the future, that had about 40 recommendations in it, and obviously the jewel in the crown of those was delivering the tonnage tax, and that had two essential objectives: grow the fleet and grow the UK maritime skills base.
Right.
So there was a link between. So if you entered the tonnage tax, which brings you some tax benefits and certainty about what you will pay back to the exchequer, you pay a fee rather than the normal tax on your profits, and you have to train a certain number of young officers. 1 in 15 for every 15 officers in the fleet, you train 1 per year.
Right.
And that did increase both the numbers of ships on the flag and also the number of seafarers.
But what was the sanction
trained.
then if you didn't join that? I mean, what was the stick?
Complete carrot. To be honest with you, it's all about carrot. It's all about encouraging ships, because essentially ships, they can choose where they register. And although there is an international legal requirement that basically says that any country can set up its own flag.
Right.
That's the first principle. But in order to do that, they must exercise oversight and jurisdiction and control over those vessels and the crew on board.
Right.
And to do that, there needs to be a genuine link. And that is satisfied by the ship owner being in the flag state.
Right.
And as I said, that doesn't happen in Panama,
right.
Marshall Islands and Liberia.
Right.
But it should happen in the UK.
Right.
Although, interestingly, you did make the point about the amount of British ownership. There is significant amount of UK-owned tonnage, most of which isn't registered in the UK.
Most is flagged.
Flagged out in flags of convenience, indeed.
So the tonnage tax, did it work at all?
Well, initially there was a growth in the flag, and there was a growth in the skills. But I think the financial crisis must have had an impact in 2008, 2009. We saw that tailing off. And if you don't stay engaged, and if you don't keep the tonnage tax under review, others come along and they copy what you're doing, and they do a little bit better. They offer a little bit of an incentive there, a little bit of incentive there. And what you see is the ship owners drifting away because they go and choose those other ones.
Right.
And I'm afraid politicians, and I'm not making a political point here, they kind of get dragged away into other issues. And I mentioned Charting the Future, which had 40 recommendations. They didn't deliver the 40. Now, if we go back to 2010 onwards, this government, the Tory Conservative government, they had a policy that was introduced in about 2018, Maritime 2050, with a whole bunch of recommendations, and again, they don't deliver all of those because they move on, they get bored, they go and do other things, and
So
that's
some of them
really
are positive,
frustrating.
right? So some of those
many of them are positive,
right,
but
right.
you know what we were calling for was more funding for maritime training, because for every pound you spend on UK maritime training, every pound they spend on one of my young members to train them up to be an officer generates £4.80 for the Exchequer. It's the most incredible deal I've ever come across.
In terms of what? How
Well, the
does that
return,
work?
the salaries they earn to,
Right.
and they bring it back here and they spend it here. The growth in the contribution to the economy. It's you know, this, I mean, it's not my calculation. It's Oxford Economics calculation, which they did for the government. So, well, I don't know why they don't invest more. There's high quality.
So training is very much
jobs.
a big part of your demands.
Absolutely, centre stage. We want more funding extended to maritime training. We need ship owners to be held accountable for that training, to make sure it's quality training, and critically, the sea time is valuable time away learning the job. And we made some recommendations for a new national maritime training organisation to this government. We didn't do it on our own volition. This came through the Maritime Skills Commission, which is again one of the recommendations from Maritime 2050 to establish that body. I serve on it, but we did our own study, and two key things that we recommended that have not been delivered. One was to deliver this centralised, regulated, with power to enforce and hold the ship owners and the training providers to account. That was the jewel, if you like, and also increase the support from 50% currently to about 100% to 800% to encourage and incentivize the ship owners to train our people and ultimately employ them when they're qualified. It takes about 3.5 years to do that.
Right. Is that the key? You've set out a manifesto for the next government. Is that the key aspects of it?
There's four key aspects to our manifesto. First of all, we talk about future-proofing skills and training, and that's really about the just transition. That's preparing those maritime professionals of today to upskill and reskill them so they've got secure employment for the future. I mean, we've got all this environmental change, decarbonisation. We've got the target of net zero by 2050. We don't want our seafarers to be left behind.
Right.
They're introducing all sorts of alternative fuels to move away from marine diesel and heavy oil to ammonia and hydrogen, and even fully electric ships where they, cross the channel, for example, shorter routes. So all of that is going to bring in new requirements, new technology, and the need for new skills and new training. So, and the ship owners should pay for that. I mean, that's the key. We don't think our members should pay for that. So that's our just transition. We want full employment protection. So that really leans into the experience of Pinot Fraser that you mentioned.
We'll come to that.
And I'm sure you'll want to explore that with me a bit later. But there's a whole area of measures that we need, ending fire and rehire and that sort of thing. We want to create a stronger UK shipping industry domestically and internationally. So we want the government to look at the prospects of cabotage.
So what does that mean?
That would be restricting trade UK coastwise port, UK port, to grow a domestic industry, encourage the UK flag, require attach conditions to procurement, for example.
So in other words, you wouldn't allow a foreign vessel to go from Newcastle to London or something like that?
Yeah, something like that. Exactly. Right. Yeah,
Okay.
That's a very good way of describing it.
Okay.
I mean, there's various ways in which that cabotage could be introduced. It's very common globally. I mean, perhaps the best example is the USA. They have the Jones Act, which regulates all coastwise traffic.
Yes, the great free market economy is very good at kind of
absolutely looking out for their own.
Yes,
I mean, there's 650,000 maritime jobs directly in Jones Act trades. Really? We'd like a bit of that. So that's something we think that the government should commit. A future government should commit to securing. And there's also that international outreach and making sure that we tackle flags of convenience, because if we don't do that, it's constantly chopping the legs off everybody and driving standards down.
Yeah, but we've heard that for years. And people said, but Liberia and Panama, they shouldn't be allowed to do this. And when you do get a major catastrophe around those flags of convenience, there's always outrage. But no action.
Well, I mean that's fair. That's a fair comment. I mean this building that we sit in now is owned. It's the head office of the International Transport Workers Federation. They've been fighting flag state convenience for 75 years. Right. And they will not give up, and we wouldn't let them. It's an absolute fundamental thing.
Let me ask from a naive point of view. If you're running ships worldwide, and I can understand then, if you're going ships coming in from Japan or America or whatever, it's quite difficult to regulate that in terms of making sure they were flagged appropriately or whatever. But within Europe, or even within the UK, say ships between Belfast and Scotland, can't you then ensure that those are flagged appropriately and that those are then subject to much greater regulation?
Well, you can, but historically the UK has always been sort of open coast. That's always been their sort of philosophy.
Open coast.
Open coast. Anybody can come here. Everybody can trade. There are essentially no limits, and then I mean we do have a system globally, although it's not a global system. It's a network of regional systems of port state control.
Right.
And I have to say that port state control, like that undertaken by the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency here in this country, is very effective at implementing the international standards or the local standards that apply in those circumstances. But the very fact that we have port state control is a consequence of the failure of flag state control. So the flag states don't pay for port state control. Right. The port states pay for that.
Right.
Flag states are free to trade around the world, doing what they want, not held to account under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea for effective oversight and control of their vessels, ensuring there's a genuine link. And port state has to pick up the pieces and mop it all up when there's a pollution incident or there's a problem in delay the ships or whatever. But coming back to your point, of course, that's essentially what cabotage is about. And I was about to make the point that there's an organisation called Seafarers' Rights International. They did a 2018. They're currently working on an update, but the 2018 report on cabotage revealed, quite surprisingly to me at least, that the majority of countries have cabotage in one form or another. So if you don't have cabotage, if you're open coast, you're a bit of an outlier.
Right, but we're open coast. We don't have any regulations about that.
Well, we do in a sense, and this is just the way things have developed. It's come back to P&O ferries, if I may, for a second on this point, because one of the consequences of P&O ferries' actions is the government has said, well, we will extend the national minimum wage and we will bring in albeit a voluntary welfare charter, and we will require any vessel that comes into a port in the UK more than 120 times per annum, and they will be covered by that legislation, the national minimum wage, regardless of flag or nationality of crew, and they will be encouraged to sign the welfare charter. And the French government did the same. Now, this was reported on upon at the time. The French legislation is due to come into force in July. Right. The UK legislation, of course, is now forestalled because of the general election. But the hope is, the expectation would be, whoever gets in is going to pick that up. If it's a Conservative government, seems unlikely in the current polling, but if it is a Conservative government, then we'll be on them quickly to make sure that they pick up where they left off. Right. If it's a Labour government, they've committed not only to the extension of the national minimum wage legislation, but also to turn that voluntary welfare charter into a statutory welfare charter. This
stems out of the P&O?
Yeah. Right. So in effect, what we've got is cabotage.
Right.
Because now you've got flag-blind requirements in order to work on our coast and in our ports, which set the benchmark for minimum standards for foreign seafarers, essentially, but all seafarers in effect, at a level which isn't these international minimums that the likes of P&O ferries and Irish ferries are relying on.
Explain to me exactly what P&O ferries did then. I mean, they essentially sacked everybody.
They just sacked everybody. I think they decided that negotiating with the union that they'd negotiated with throughout their recent history, throughout, there was a P&O part of a very famous company, Pinot Oriental Steam Navigation Company, Pacific
Peninsula
and
Orient.
Oriental. Yeah,
Yes.
you got me there.
Yeah.
Peninsula and Oriental Steam Navigation Company was a huge company, hugely significant for 200 years or more, and it all came down to that moment when a bloke who used to run Green King pubs decided that he would presumably do the bidding of DP World in Dubai and say, sack them all. He didn't feel the need to. I mean, 12 months before, during COVID, we'd actually negotiated, not happily, I have to say, but there was a proper negotiation and there was a bunch of redundancies.
Right.
So to say that we're not an organisation that isn't reasonable and can see how things are going and whether the company's profitable or not, there's a proper way to do it, complying with the legislation.
They just
But
decided.
they decided
They just said, well,
we don't really want to
sackable.
bother
So
all
they,
of that.
They didn't
we just sacked them.
rehire any of those guys. They must have had a whole bunch of other guys ready.
No, I don't think initially they intended to rehire anyone.
Oh, right.
Right, but they did end up rehiring about 90 of our people. Our people are the ones who've got the certificates of competency you need as a
skills
minimum,
to run,
right? The
yeah.
skills and experience and the certification to prove it to run those ships. And crucially, some of the senior officers would also have a pilot exemption certificate as well, which is really crucial, right? So you can go in and out of ports
Without
frequently
having a pilot.
without having to take a pilot.
I've just done
right.
it. I've just come
Have
into Oosteram and
Excellent.
I noticed there was no pilot taken.
Right,
Right.
There you go. And so they then had to backpedal. They had to incentivise. They offered bonuses. They were scrabbling around, and obviously some of our guys went back.
But they still sacked a few hundred people. Then.
We're talking the 756, I think, off the top of my head, and they probably took back on about 80 or so of our people, and as far as I know, they're still there. I mean, interestingly, they've all the evidence that we've seen is that they are already responding to the French legislation and indicating that those crews, some of those foreign crews that they took on, are going to have to be let go.
Okay, so what was the wage difference?
Well, look, you're probably something in the region of, let's take an AB. That's our standard benchmark when we look at wages. An AB, an able seafarer, yeah. So a senior rating, highly skilled and highly experienced in what they do, and really crucial part of the team. You're probably looking at a Brit earning certainly north of £30,000 a year.
Right.
They're working on the short sea. They might be working 1 week on, 1 week off. It could be 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. If it was, depends which company and which route.
And instead,
they're taking people on. And look, these figures are in public record.
Right.
He's admitted this.
Yes.
£5.20. It turns out it was £4.70 an hour.
Yes, they're select committee.
And they're working 12 hours a day, and they're doing 17-week rosters. Which
17 weeks solid?
17 weeks solid without a doubt. If they can't come ashore because they don't have visas or work permits to come ashore, they're stuck on the vessel and they're doing 17 weeks. Now that's what this represented, and it is significant that those vessels were flag of convenience. P&O Ferries has operated Bahamian and Bermudan vessels for quite some time, and they've argued that those vessels were too old and too problematic to come onto the UK flag because of the different standards. But the vessels on the short sea were flagged out.
That's not entirely
ahead of
reassuring.
Brexit.
It's not reassuring for us who might use the Channel ferries, I must say, yes.
The port state control is there to make sure that they're okay. So let's be, let me try and be as balanced as I possibly can. It's sometimes very difficult because I get so involved and so engaged in it.
I remember going for a walk in Dover, above Dover, and seeing that they were docked for a while, weren't they?
Well, they were, yes, because it's not just about the fire extinguishers and the deck fittings and the steel and the ships and the lights and checking all of that's okay, because what changed from one day to the other in that respect? Nothing. But when you put a completely new crew on, or for the large part new crew on, you have a team that are not familiar with each other. They don't know how everything operates, and they need to do drills and tests and make sure the MCA, the port state control people, need to make sure that they can operate those ships effectively, and that's where the delay came in.
Right.
I mean, I don't understand how they thought they would. I mean, they planned for a week out of action or something, and it was
How long was
weeks and weeks. Some of them were out of, from memory. I think it was at least over a month.
Right. In which they lost a lot of money.
Must
and
have
of
lost
course, a
an absolute
reputational
fortune.
risk and all that. So, I mean, will it, when this legislation comes in, will it be possible for them to do that again? Or will it end this ability to just sack everybody and take on foreign
Well,
workers?
look, we're beyond this, the minimum wage, beyond welfare charter, beyond the tougher French legislation, beyond even the hope that a new government may implement the CIFRE's welfare charter as a mandatory instrument. Beyond that, we hope that a government, a future government, will amend the legislation that provided I can't think of any other way of describing it than a loophole, an unintentional loophole, which Peter Hebblethwaite and his team were able to exploit. So we need changes to the Trade Union Labour Relations Act. We need to end fire and rehire, and those are part of, at least in the case of Labour, part of their fair deal.
But if
for
the French
people.
side do that would be enough, wouldn't it, for these channel ferries? Anyway.
Well, at least for the short sea. Of
Yes.
course, there are worries, and this is again part of our manifesto ask, that we need the government, a future government, to look at the French example, how the UK and the French were able to work together and coordinate and cooperate to close down and regulate that route to ensure that there won't be any social dumping.
Right.
And we need our Dutch and Belgium, Danish, we need the Irish in particular as well to look at that as well. So the government could, we were worried, and we had heard that companies like Irish Ferries and Pinot Ferries would lodge challenges in Europe against what the French and, to lesser extent what the British have done. Now that we're outside the EU, we won't be held to account by the EU. But that doesn't seem to have, I'm touching wood, because that hasn't happened so far.
Right.
So I don't know what the French government seems very, very comfortable and content, or not content. They seem to be confident that this is beyond challenge.
Right.
Right, and they have focused very much on safety by saying the 2 week on 2 week roster is the maximum.
Okay.
And that's been, apart from the wage issue, that's been their main argument.
There is another important aspect to this, which is about resilience, national security. I mean, after all, we are very heavily dependent on shipping, as the D-Day celebrations that we've just had show indeed how important it is to what is a maritime nation. So are there some problems there, given the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East and so on? Is this an important issue?
It is. Look, when we think about China's policy, one belt, one road, there's a clear indication within that policy of dominating maritime transport. When we look at the war, Russia invades Ukraine, and look at the consequences of that on gas prices, supplies of fuel. When we look at the Middle East situation, Houthi rebels attacking ships get rerouted. We see ships get stuck in the canal, ships get rerouted. All of this has a consequence and impact. COVID and supply chain dislocation, because 1.4 million seafarers got locked in and locked out.
Right.
They were stuck on their ships for some of them up to 2 years. Others were locked at home and couldn't go away to sea because there was no way to join and leave the vessel. When we think about the consequences of that on an island nation with a 1,000-year or more history of trade and maritime engagement, and you just break out into a cold sweat.
Okay, but what can a government do about that? I mean, those are external events.
First of all, it can understand those risks, and it can understand the importance of having a strong merchant navy alongside a strong, in our case, Royal Navy, because the one go together. We've got to guarantee and ensure that we can supply our country with, well, let me say, the figure is 95% of everything arrives or leaves this country by sea. And we have to have a stake in that industry. Right. I believe passionately, and many academics and many organisations and stakeholders would support the notion that an island nation like us, we need a merchant navy, a strong merchant navy, alongside a strong naval deterrent, and without maritime professionals, we can't have either. So we need to invest, we need to find a way to grow our industry domestically and internationally and underpin that with local maritime skills, and that's our people. That's the jobs and the livelihoods of our people.
So to end, your demands, let's assume it's a Labour government, your demands will be to the Labour government precisely what?
Well, end fire and rehire.
Yeah.
Let's have a seafarers welfare charter that is mandatory. Let's press ahead with the minimum wage, the extension of the minimum wage, as was promised.
Well, which doesn't apply to shipping at the moment.
Well, it does, but it wasn't sufficient in the example of P&O ferries, right? So again, you had to have a close connection to the UK,
right? And
that's not the case when you have a Cypriot vessel with foreign crew on agency terms and conditions.
Okay, those things. What else?
That's
anything
the sort
else?
of we need to change the system whereby a company can factor in, price in, not complying with the legislation as a way around that legislation, around the obligation to consult the unions.
A bigger stick.
Then, a bigger stick. That's going to be really important to protect employment in the UK. Let's look at cabotage. Let's see if we can make that work in the UK context. I understand the sort of long history of being open to trade, but how can we ensure that we have an opportunity to grow jobs in coastal communities? The leader debate today is in Cleethorpes, Great Yarmouth, and Grimsby. These are communities that were completely left behind by globalisation and free movement in Europe. And we need to look at those communities and say, how can we bring good quality jobs? Well, look, there's a massive boom in offshore renewables. All around that coast, wind farms springing up. There are jobs, but there should be more jobs for those installing and maintaining those fields going forward. As fishing shrinks, as the oil and gas industry transits to offshore renewables, there has to be a just transition for those workers, for the fishing industry to grow as well. And I don't understand why this is even remotely contentious, but in some quarters it is. We've got to be open, we've got to allow everybody to come in and do what they like, and if we set these arbitrary limits, we will disincentivize investment. Well, that's not happening in Denmark, it's not happening in Norway, it's not even happening in the United States, where they've said on their coast, offshore renewables, it's got to be American jobs, good unionized American jobs. We're just saying, hey, if it's good enough for them, why can't it be good enough for them? These players, these international players, they will, in Denmark, Ørsted works closely with the unions and develops and invests in offshore wind. And when they come anywhere else, why shouldn't they do the same, whether they're in America or Australia or here? That's all we're asking for, the same opportunity for good quality jobs and to invest in those coastal communities. If we're going to level up, that seems an opportunity it's staring us right in the face.
So, Mark, thank you very much for explaining a lot about the industry general, your role in it, and it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian.
Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, this is not really a transport policy issue, but I just thought I'd share with listeners my experience over last weekend, starting on D-Day, with riding round the Normandy and seeing the beaches and seeing all the commemorations and whatever, and in aid of the Armed Forces charity, SSAFA, the Armed Forces charity, who raise money for basically veterans in trouble. And I must say the whole experience was very moving. We cycled around, so many different sites, Bayeux Cemetery, Omaha, which is incredible kind of cemetery there, which just crosses kind of stretching as far as you can see. And, and it all brings home to me the fact that, wars are terrible things, and it's a shame that we haven't kind of learned that lesson. But personally, I had the most amazing time. We cycled 230 miles in 3 days. which I really didn't think I would manage to do, but it was a fantastic experience. And so if you have a few bob, you can find the donation on my website for the Armed Forces Society. So toss in a few bob. It's really worth it. But it was a fantastic experience.
Calling All Stations, the Transport Podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do also follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle is @AllStationsPod.